What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? Hello, this video gets real rough real quick, so if you have a hard time with violence against kids I suggest you skip this one. Nishiba train disaster is something that reminds me how death can come at any moment. A train with 51 wagons of sulfur, fertilizer, petrol and cotton wool somehow broke loose and rolled down the track about 20 kilometers until it derailed in the town of Qam, Iran. There were no humans on board. Chemical leaks ensued and authorities tried to extinguish whatever fires broke out. At one point, the whole thing explodes. And it really explodes. The whole town of Qam is literally demolished. 3 nearby towns are badly damaged and it was heard 70 kilometers away. The wreckage continued to explode for several days after. Around 300 people died and more than that injured. An earthquake of 3.6 on the Richter scale was produced. The 1904 Cincinnati Privy disaster. In 1904, 9 schoolgirls drowned in an outhouse after the floor collapsed. They literally drowned in human waste. My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled it. A few months after buying it, he got to test those roll hoops out as he lost control and skidded down a steep bank about 10 meters, 35 feet deep. The roll hoops did their job and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he plowed through. The car ended up the right way up and he got out, walked back up the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply and dropped dead. His neck had been fractured but was in one piece right up until he turned his head when it severed his spinal cord. My mom was driving and a guy ran out in the road, so she stopped so she couldn't hit him. It was nighttime, so it was pretty dark out, and 3 other men emerged from the forest around, all trying to use the door handles of her car to get in. She locked them luckily and gassed it to the nearest town. Remember to always lock your car after you start it, because if it wasn't unlocked, who knows what would have happened to her. I would call it creepy more than scary, but my mom's friend had a small house and lived alone. She noticed weird things, a batch of soup depleting faster than usual, missing eggs, damp towels in the hamper when she hadn't used any, extra dishes in the dishwasher, etc. This went on for months. She thought she was just being forgetful. One day she heard some thumping around in her attic and went to investigate. She found some makeshift living quarters, small radio, hot plate, sleeping bag, pillow, food wrappers, etc. She called the cops, who came to keep an eye on the place. They ended up catching a homeless man climbing a tree, trying to sneak into her attic window. He had been doing this almost daily. He would wait for her to go to work, then go downstairs and help himself to food and amenities. The funny part about this story is they got to know each other throughout the ordeal, and the guy was actually very respectful, just down on his luck. She didn't press charges, instead let him move in, helped him get a job, and he lived in the attic until he got back on his feet. Creepy shit with a happy ending. Various torture murders are probably the most horrific things I've read about. Junko Furuta, who was a perfectly normal girl until she was kidnapped off the street by a gang for no reason. Purely wrong place, wrong time, according to Japanese sources, and unimaginably abused and tortured to death over 44 days. Kiki Camarena, a DEA agent in Mexico, who was kidnapped by the Guadalajara cartel and tortured to death over about 3 days. His story is the central focus of the show Narcos, Mexico, but from what I've read, his death was even more brutal than what they make it out to be. A detail consistent in both is that they brought in a doctor to revive him numerous times when he got too close to death and keep him conscious so he couldn't pass out from the pain. Kellyanne Bates, who was groomed from a young age by a scumbag who eventually killed her slowly over the course of about a month in their apartment. Her injuries were so horrific the jury at the guy's trial had to get counseling. For example, her eyes were missing and there were stab wounds in the sockets. Sylvia Likens, whose parents left her in the care of a woman who both personally and with the help of her children and their friends degraded, tortured, and killed her over several months. The Hello Kitty murder in China, where a man and his about 13-year-old girlfriend kidnapped a prostitute who had supposedly stolen from him, even though sources say she had paid him back with interest, tortured her to death, and then stuffed her corpse into a Hello Kitty toy. Baby Brianna, a newborn whose mother, father, and uncle tortured and abused her from the second they brought her home from the hospital until the second she died. Baby P, a British toddler whose mother let her boyfriend torture him to death. His back was broken in his last days of life. Honestly, there are just so many horrifically on par with each other, you could list them all day. I work at a maximum security prison and we have several inmates who are severely mentally ill. The ones that self-harm wear a Fitbit kind of thing to monitor heart rate. If there is a change we rush their room to stop whatever is happening. On top of this we also do visual inspections. On one round a co-worker was doing cell checks and noticed this particular inmate had blood on their face but nothing came up on the monitors or anything. So he called to the inmates to ask if they were okay. The inmate had their eyes closed and just kept repeating, "It doesn't hurt." The inmate would not answer where the blood was from. We opened the cell to see what the situation was, and it turns out the inmate had plucked out both of their eyes and they were laying on the floor. The inmate's hour monitor never alerted and the inmate never screamed. Paramedics said the inmate's vitals were normal and the inmate was fully responsive. What the shit? Artemis Pyle, the drummer from Lynyrd Skynyrd, survived a plane crash and walked to a nearby house, only to be shot by the homeowner. The homeowner saw a bloody long-haired man and winged him. Pyle survived that as well and made a full recovery. Before my dad died, he once told me a story from when he was in Vietnam in the 1960s. He told me about a mission where he and one other American with 5 CIDG strikers, South Vietnamese villagers turned fighters, were tasked to emplace seismic ground sensors along a trail network deep in the jungle. He said they were about 2 days into the mission when he and 2 of the strikers split off from the main group to go watch a nearby trail intersection. He said the jungle was pretty quiet that day, just the sounds of birds and bugs and an occasional monkey. He said they had been watching the trail intersection for about 3 or 4 hours and were deciding on whether to move further down the trail or to turn back and link up with the rest of the patrol. Before leaving the cover of the brush, my dad said he checked the trail ahead of them one last time and prepared his men to move. Now here is where the story gets interesting, and he told this part with absolute dead seriousness. He said just as he started to step out onto the trail he sees a light-skinned black Union cavalry soldier in full battle gear laying alongside the trail just shy of the intersection. My dad said the Union soldier had 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle and a short curved club at his hip. As my dad was trying to process what he was seeing, the soldier looked directly at him and smiled. Then the soldier slowly placed a finger up to his lips, as if to tell him to be silent, and then motioned my dad back off the trail. My dad said he signaled for his men to remain hidden, and he recalled that as he slipped back into the jungle on one side of the trail, the Union soldier did the same on his side of the trail. Less than 10 seconds later he said the lead element of a group of NVA, North Vietnamese Army soldiers, walked right through the trail intersection some 30 feet away. My dad estimated that the group was comprised of some 70-80 soldiers equipped with automatic rifles, light machine guns and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. He has no doubt that his entire team would have been wiped out on the spot. He said as soon as the enemy soldiers had passed, he and his team beat feet out of there as fast and as quietly as they could and rejoined with the rest of the patrol. He reported the enemy soldiers his team had encountered, but decided not to say anything about the soldier he had seen. My dad kept this secret for many years, only telling me just before he passed, and earlier only telling his grandmother on her deathbed in the 1970s. He said when he told his grandmother, she smiled and without opening her eyes told him, "You saw old Red Tom." Red Tom was my great-great-grandfather. He was a half-black/half Creek freeman who was a scout for the Union Army during the Civil War and later served with the US Cavalry in the American West. He was known for carrying 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle and a Creek war club into battle. When my aunt was about 16 she was working at a grocery store and had a boss in his mid-20s. One day he called the house and was begging her to sneak out and hang out with him. She was considering it because it was her boss and she didn't want to say no. My mom, who is 2 years younger than her, always gets these incredibly spot on gut feelings. She had one that night and begged my aunt not to go out with him. Thankfully she listened to my mom and told him no, which made him really angry. He ended up going out that night and meeting another girl. He took her out to some cliffs and forced himself on her and pushed her off. Somehow she lived through this and was able to get him sent to prison. I feel so sorry for that girl and so thankful for my mom and her gut feelings. Always trust your gut. I spent my first 10 years in New Delhi. Back then, we would find dead women, burnt with acid or set on fire, and it used to be so normal. Like, oh look, another one of those dowry cases, where her family didn't pay the husband enough money, so they killed her. Many years later I revisited those memories, and realized how insane that actually was. I'd totally forgotten about all that. Guy goes into a small building and dies. Later, investigator shows up and sees the body, calls 911, and then dies. Paramedics show up to help them, then die. The reason? Oxygen levels at head height were normal. Oxygen levels when bent over was basically zero. Bending over in this room killed 4 people by asphyxiation. I was in a crappy motel. The room had bed bugs. I was too exhausted to go to the front desk. I just needed to make it until the morning. I slept in the tub. Hours later I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out into the room to find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. He says, "Is this your room?" I'm like, "Yes, this is my room, man." More staring. Then he slowly starts backing out while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in. Motel on Watt Avenue, Sacramento. One night my son, 20 at the time, was brought home full down drunk by his buddy James. About a year later James got another friend drunk, checked them into a hotel, killed, dismembered and ate some of him. Old janitor from high school, friendly Ecuadorian man who went biping. Worked at the school for 20 plus years and nobody had a problem with him. I guess his wife was leaving him and in the process of moving out. He caught her in bed with her new man. Next day, in the middle of town, he opened fire on her, the man, and then killed himself before any cops had time to respond. The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally forced himself on her and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch/ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. I've left some links in the doobly-doo if you're interested. Do all the YouTube stuff and I'll see you all tomorrow or somewhere else right now.